Welcome to the EdRed podcast with Bridget Peach and Arabet Hernandez of the EdRed. For today's episode, we are joined by Judy Hackett, the Co-Interim Superintendent for Special Education District of Lake County, Tarin Kendrick, the Executive Director of Niles Township District for Special Education, and Susan Coleman, Superintendent of Golf District 67. Today's conversation will focus on special education. I'm going to kick us off with a very light question, sarcasm intended. What are the current challenges facing special education in Illinois, particularly regarding funding and resources for schools?
Good morning. This is Tarin Kendrick. I think one of the major problems that we're facing is our personnel issue and a lack of personnel. And really, no matter how much money a district has to throw at personnel, it still is a significant problem, and that is across the state. It's not just unique to suburban districts, it's suburban, urban, and rural as well. And we just don't have the personnel to be able to, we just don't have the personnel available to hire, and that becomes an issue. Another issue that I see is the IDEA. It's federally funded at such a low level that it has to be made up by state and local funds. And since the federal government is not paying its share, it makes it challenging to provide this high quality program for these intensive students that we often see. Our legislator did just pass Senate Bill 3606, which did equalize funding for students in public and private therapeutic day schools. This equalization was a very beneficial first step. It is not our end goal, but it was a significant step forward. The next step would be to increase the funding for equalization. It will not be a fully equalized system until we increase the funding and look at all students who are high cost, regardless of where they're educated.
I couldn't agree more, Tarin. This is Susan Coleman, Superintendent of Golf School District 67. I think when we look at public schools, one of the biggest challenges I see is the mental health crisis and how that has been put on public schools to sort of mediate and fix. But the truth is that public schools are not experts in mental health. As public school districts, we have certified personnel to help provide the services that we need for our special education students, such as school social workers and school psychologists and school speech pathologists and school OTs and PTs. But what we do not have are experts in mental health. And that is generally something that we see outside of school with families who are dealing with mental health crisis in a way that is much more targeted to how the home contributes to mental health. It involves medication management sometimes and other strategies. And as school districts, we certainly are there to support the families in any way we can, but that is not our area of expertise. And what I see is more and more mental health issues being brought into school with little to no extra funding. And the way certificates work is that in order to be a school psychologist, you have to have a certificate that allows you to practice social work in schools. That is not the same as an outside therapist or a mental health professional. And it's not necessarily funding that we need to hire these experts. It's really a partnership within the communities so that our families can have these wraparound services, working with state agencies to fund these programs. And these are the same challenges we've had historically, but they are compounded by the complexity of needs for our children and families that we are now facing. So to me, that's mental health crisis, which also drives some behavior issues, which can be disruptive in schools, is a very big issue, but not something that public school districts, can or should be expected to solve on their own.
And Susan, would you say, this is Tarin just asking this question, would you say this is just a special education crisis, or would you say this is across the spectrum?
Oh, I apologize. Thank you for clarifying. No, this is across the spectrum. This is all of our students, gen ed, special ed, gifted, students with second languages, low income students, students from high earning families. As I've worked across Northern Illinois, I've seen this problem for years and years. It is getting worse, because I believe that in Illinois, the services are not as robust as they need to be. And when we do try to support families to receive psychiatric or other specialized help, often there's a wait list of 6 to 9 months. So we certainly have a shortage of that in the areas. And right now we're in the suburbs of Chicago. I can only imagine when I talk to my colleagues down south or in more rural areas where those types of services are even less available. So yes, this is not a special education problem.
Perfect segue to our next question, because both you and Tarin both mentioned there's a big difference demographically and geographically on special ed. So whether it's city, suburban, or rural, there are an array of disparities. Tarin, do you mind just speaking to that and what can be done to address those disparities to make sure all kids have equal access to service?
Yes, thanks. I think that, it's each district's responsibility in terms of special education to provide FAPE, which is a free and appropriate public education. It does not matter where you live in Illinois, a district has that responsibility to all of their students. As mentioned previously, we know the federal government is not appropriately funding IDEA. Therefore, the state and local dollars need to make up that difference. Since the passage of EBF, which is evidence-based funding, this has helped give districts stability. It has not solved the problem, but it has certainly leveled out the playing field for our districts, both, especially our districts that do lack funding and more of maybe those rural areas, or the districts that just don't have the property wealth of other districts, which is a problem we know in Illinois. We need the state to continue to fund EBF because it is working to help the least wealthy districts. Another issue, as we've mentioned already, is personnel that is available. Suburbs have more of a dense population and have more access to personnel and can build programs because of the dense population. There are more students to access those programs. So you may have a program for students with autism because you may have 10 students that have similar needs across, maybe 2-3 grade levels. Well, that'll look very different in a rural area. You may only have one student, so building a program for one student is much more difficult in those types of areas. And I just think that those are the things, when we talk about personnel, those are the things that we also need to talk about, areas that rural versus suburban and urban, really the access to that, and that does impact the programming for special education.
When I speak to my colleagues in rural communities, their overall access to community resources is very limited. And again, you can give a district money to hire an on-call psychiatrist or a specialized behavior person. But like to Tarin's point, if that person doesn't live anywhere near these rural communities and you can't find them, then that money doesn't make up the difference for the lack of services that are available both in public schools and in the greater community at large.
So some of the other challenges that schools are facing, especially post-COVID, that we've seen is the behavioral and emotional needs of students. My question is, in terms of special education programs, what are some of the challenges that you guys are seeing? And then additionally, any potential solutions that you recommend?
Thank you, Arabed. This is Judy Hackett, and as my two other colleagues have many, many years in this field, the complexity of social and emotional and behavioral challenges for students continue to increase over the years. And much like Susan mentioned, for all children, we are definitely seeing that in special education. In fact, a lot of students are in more specialized programs because of the challenges that they have behaviorally, their inability to regulate their behavior, what's acceptable in a gen ed classroom, on and on. So I think some of those challenges have continued to increase for a number of reasons, much that we've talked about already, but really because of some of the structures, some of the strategies necessary, some of the training for personnel, both gen ed and special ed personnel and leadership on how to navigate when a student is really having a really hard time in a class, whether it's a gen ed class or a special ed class. And the other piece is, as much of what we know kind of holistically, is how do we help families navigate that home and school connection? A student that has a very tough night comes to school with that hard night in their school environment. So really navigating that, I think the partnership piece with our community friends and colleagues, there are resources, more resources now at the state level, but navigating and finding them, particularly at a crisis level or when a student is really in of what we know as a kind of a behavioral crisis, how to best get that child support is really a collective focus for both the school and the family and the community partners.
And just to echo that, Judy, what we're seeing in public schools, we now have in the last 3 districts I've been in, we have built sensory rooms in all of our schools, elementary, middle, and high school. And interestingly, they are mostly used by our gen ed students because they're not able to, regulate their emotions, or they have other trauma that they experience that makes school very difficult for them, and lots of triggers. And again, to your point, we need so much more training for our gen ed population on how to support these students, even before they become special education, or if they need to become special education students. But currently, we don't have the tier 1 or the gen ed personnel trained really to help us. So we are constantly reacting, I feel, in a gen ed setting, as opposed to, maybe being more proactive.
Right. I totally agree. I think, as Susan references, the tier 1 under multi-tiered systems of support, it really is for all students, but at the foundation, really in the coordination between academic and social emotional learning is really having behavioral supports throughout all of the tiers, and certainly the sensory needs, the training, the recent legislation in the last couple of years related to the restraint and timeout, and the requirements for staff for all districts to make sure that their staff is trained in restraint and timeout, and the kinds of strategies and supports to provide for students in the case that they have escalating behavior, and how to debrief about that, how to work through those issues with both staff, students, and their families.
And I'll just add one thing. I appreciate what my colleague said. This is a systemic problem, and it's not just a special education problem, but I do think we have experts in special education that can help and prepare our colleagues, our general education colleagues, and support them with strategies in the classroom. And it kind of takes us back to that personnel piece as well. I think students coming out of college programs to become teachers, to become speech pathologists, this is an area that we probably could better prepare them as well. And I think that our students that are in general education settings look different than they did even 5 years ago. And I think our students that are in special education look very different than they did 5 years ago. So it's kind of taking these approaches and how do we apply them system-wide. And as Judy mentioned, what does that tier 1 level of support look like in a general education classroom? And how can special education experts who are experts in behavior really support their general education colleagues and make sure that we have these supports for students throughout their time, because we are seeing a different type of student than we've seen in the past. And I do think that's really important. The other thing is we talked about partnerships and community support. And I know that we are going to have a new Department of Early Childhood. And I think this focus really needs to start earlier than the mandated age of kindergarten for school, right? I think we really need to look early on, and how do we support families? How do we support parents? How do we teach parents, help them with skills for parenting? We know screen time is not something that is good for kids, but how do we make sure we give parents the tools? What other things can parents be doing with their kids? How can we socialize kids sooner than kindergarten? What does that look like so that kids can hit the ground running and be successful in a school setting? So whether it's early childhood, preschool, whether it's a play group, whether it's a park district program, we really need to help and support our families. And I think that's going to start much earlier than their entry into elementary school.
And just, Tarin, you just reminded me of something when we talk about our personnel and our teacher prep programs. We have amazing gen ed teachers, and they are responsible for so many things in one class of maybe 30 kids. But what I hear time and time again from my new staff is that I only had to take one class in special education. I only had to take one class about behaviors, depending on which university you went to. And I feel like that systemically is a problem, because special ed kids are gen ed kids first. So they're going to be in everybody's classroom. So I do feel like we need to do a better job of preparing our gen ed staff at the collegiate level on skills and strategies to work with such diverse learners.
There have been more than a few legislative initiatives proposed and passed in recent years. There are two we want to highlight, and we already touched on one, SB 3606, the equalization bill that Ed read along with others worked on, as well as an extension of services for students up to the age of 22. I'd like to just take a moment to talk about the impact both of those have had. Judy, we'll start with you with SB 3606. And then
Great.
Tarin, if you can talk about the 22nd birthday bill, that would be great.
I'm happy to. Near and dear to me over the last more than a decade, for sure. And I'm fortunate to be working in one of the larger co-ops in the state now and see it firsthand in terms of the impact. We are very appreciative of certainly Ed Red, but really the legislators and overwhelming support this year on 3606, and really all the state organizations coming together and really kind of a practice that was back in the 70s when public schools were certainly not anywhere close to where we are now in terms of building capacity and strategies and resources for students. So this legislation is really a great opportunity for us to continue to serve students in a public program. Co-ops work very closely with their member district partners in really building that capacity and the relationship between, as a student develops some skills, returning back to their home school as appropriate based on their needs. It really is the intensity piece of it. And again, there is a relationship between providing really great, intense, and effective programming for students and the resources and the costs associated with that. So when it's disparate in terms of funding reimbursement, then it just compounds the issues for districts having to really make sure that they're supporting their students well. So this is really, we think, a game changer in terms of the ability for public schools to continue to work closely with districts, certainly continue to work with our private program partners as well. We do see a correlation between that funding and appropriations. So we do think that this year will be really critical on how that reimbursement the mechanics of it will evolve, and then how the appropriations, now that we have a very good sense of how that looks, how many students are over that 2 times per capita, and the real cost of that, to be able to make sure that we have the state appropriations to support that really level of intensity of students.
So now that's all great, Judy. I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
Especially in the context of a new General Assembly coming in come January and the budgetary pressures that the legislature faces. But a lot of work's to be done, but a great step in the right direction. I'm going to turn it over to Tarin to talk a little bit about a piece of legislation that was discussed and passed over a year and a half ago, probably 2 years now, regarding services to students through their 22nd birthday. Can you talk about the impact that has had on students and their schools?
Yes. So I would say this bill, when it was passed, I think, because it's one of those feel goods, right? Like it came forth, and it was, for folks that don't know, so students, when they turned the age of 22, that was the day before was their last day of school. So that doesn't always feel right? If their birthday was December 14th, all of a sudden on December 13th, that's their last day of school. Their peers are still in school and, finishing out possibly the year or not. That made it difficult. So there was a plea from parents that said, hey, can they finish out their year, their 22nd year? And naturally, it felt like, why shouldn't they? They should be able to finish out their 22nd year. But when you really look at this in whole, it's putting another burden on the schools that they weren't prepared to, now have these students finish out their 22nd year. If they were in a placement that maybe was holding spots for other students, they weren't available until, again, at the end of the school year. But more importantly was the adult services. So we really have to take a look at the adult services and see when our students are accessing those services, and having all of the students age out at the same time. So they all finish and graduate in May. Now they're all accessing the adult services at the same time. That is really putting a strain on adult services, which already is a strained system. They don't have enough personnel for the adult services. And this just exacerbated again, this situation, which we were trying to fix. The other thing where I see this as an inequity is that students, when they enter for special education, they can enter at the age of 3. So it's on their 3rd birthday is when they're eligible to enter school if they are eligible under IDEA. So that would potentially give kids almost a whole year if they're entering at their 3rd birthday, if maybe let's say it's September, but now they get to stay in through their 22nd year. So now they have a whole extra year of school. We know that's great, but I also think we need to look at the adult services and how those could be more impactful to the students and making sure we're accessing that system as well. And I struggle sometimes because the answer always seems to be put it on the schools, and the schools, this is just another one of those unfunded mandates that was put forth, and the schools didn't see any relief for this. But yet we're doing it. But I do think we should have been looking more at adult services and how we can better support there.
I couldn't agree with you more, Tarin. Having worked in 4 different counties in Illinois, I can tell you that the most basic challenge our families see when they leave public education is transportation. Because since they were 18 for the last 4 years, perhaps they had a job, or they had community outings, or they had other experiences on special rec programs. And now that ends, and there is no public transportation in many areas to take these young adults into that next phase of their life. And many parents work full time because having an adult with special needs is extremely expensive, and you have to prepare for that financially, many, many, many years prior, especially if you want to get them into some of the more sought after adult programs. There's waiting lists that are 15, 20 years long. So it is disheartening to see a school district that has a wonderful transition program, and these students are working in their communities, and many of them get offered jobs after that. But with no transportation, oftentimes these young adults are forced to stay at home because there's simply no way for them to get to the services that they need. And I feel like that on a very basic level is a huge challenge that prohibits some of our most independent, high functioning, young adults to be able to have that more independent lifestyle where they can work within their community.
I think, Susan, I agree as well. And I think it goes back to one of those other questions about disparity geographically. In some areas, some regions of the state, something like a PACE service there's a customization for adults with disabilities. And so they can use funds differently. In another place, that might not even be an option. So even when there is a job opportunity of maybe 30 hours a week, and if they don't have the way to get to and from work, and their family can't, then it's just not a feasible, it's just not going to work. And so I agree, it limits opportunities. I also think that the adult programs and the availability of them, kind of coupled with what Tarin just talked about with age 22, is parents are really competing with each other at a really critical time of age 22 to get that spot in an adult program for their students that are more significant and need that level. And that piece is really challenging for families. And there's criteria for that. We've had a parent group when we were at SSEO that really kind of tried to take it on with legislators and communities and say, if a child needs medication, they weren't allowed to go to certain programs. Well, there's a lot of limitations to that. And so what did those adults with disabilities do? They stayed home, and they are still staying home at 24, 25, and 45. And that piece is disheartening, because it really, all the work in education isn't now available for them as adults to be able to access continued learning and opportunities and programs and community.
In our last episode, we had Eric Santos of the Learning Technology Center of Illinois join us for a conversation on AI and its use in schools. What role does technology play in special education in your school districts in Illinois, and how accessible are these tools for students with disabilities?
So
Tarin,
I think this is Tarin. I think that AI is such a great resource for our educators. And I think we are just very much skimming the surface on how to really use it and how we can be more effective and efficient with it. Illinois has 2 state projects for special educators that I want to bring to everyone's attention. One is Infinitec and one is the Illinois Assistive Technology Project. Both of these play a huge role in special education. And because of those state projects, technology is readily available to our students and our staff. They're able to provide some high quality professional development. They have loaner devices, so assistive technology devices for our students. Sometimes you need to trial those. They have those devices available. They do AT, assistive technology evaluations for students. They provide support to staff to do those evaluations, more of like kind of like an on-the-job learning to try to teach staff how to do those evaluations. And they have a variety of other services, really with the most up-to-date technology available. So it is really exciting that our state is a leader in that with these 2 state projects. I think that if we're looking at AI, some areas for me that I really see that could be impactful to our educators is it can provide some relief to the IEP paperwork. It can provide some relief to lesson planning. One thing that I just find so fascinating that when I was a teacher teaching kids to learn to read, adapting passages for students. So you can have a 5th grade reading passage and say to AI, put this in a 1st or 2nd grade level. This is something that really used to take hours and hours. And now with the assistive AI, it can be done, within 5 minutes, right? So I think we have only, like I said, scratched the surface, and it can be such a powerful tool for educators. And we just need to make sure we're providing the right professional development on it and really harness it correctly.
I totally agree. I think for many of us, we know that technology and certainly assistive technology has been a part of special education for many, many years. And for many of our students, their voice, all sorts of technology has been the communication devices that students who are nonverbal use every minute of every day. And so that piece and continuing to kind of see the progression of AI with putting some parameters in it and some greater understanding of how to use that is only going to help maybe make us work more efficiently, save us some time in some of those things that Tarin just mentioned, but also give greater access for our students in terms of the world of learning. And we see all of those things as great opportunities to continue.
I agree with both of you ladies. As I've always said, special education, we were the first early adopters of artificial intelligence. So we've been using it for a long, long time. But I agree. I think the new opportunities there, not only for students to have more facilitation of their own learning by using to learn those tools and put information in a way that they can understand and comprehend. And also, again, helping our teachers with differentiation, who, again, I, like Tarin and Judy, spent years and years and years, taking passages and trying to rework them for our individualized learners. So yeah, I'm excited about what's to come.
For our final question, I'd love to hear from you, all 3 of you, really, to discuss advocacy legislative next steps. As I mentioned before, we're coming up on a brand new General Assembly. When the election happens, we'll have a new slate of folks in the General Assembly working down in Springfield. What are some of the legislative actions or advocacy efforts that our members, our partner organizations can do to support this population that we're talking about? That's so important, whether you're talking about actions that are going to benefit the students directly or the staff or even the families.
I'm going to start, and I'll take it to the personnel that I started off with, and I'll end it with that. I think that is a big advocacy and action that we need. We need to develop partnerships with universities and assist universities to add capacity so they can offer programs for things like our related services, such as school psychologists, vision itinerants, occupational therapists. These are shortage areas for us in Illinois. But we just are not training enough people to meet the needs that are in the field. And so I always think about it. We're very fortunate in our northern districts. I'm in Skokie, Lincolnwood, Morton Grove, and Niles. And I always feel like if I have vacancies here, then people downstate are probably really hurting. And so that just tells me, and speaking with my colleagues across the state, trying to develop programs, working with programs that are in different states to try to have a school psychology program that's virtual so that we can have more people trained. So we really need to assist our universities financially so that they're able to build these programs, and also then provide incentives for students to choose these programs and to come out with degrees so that they can really impact schools. So for me, that would be one of the biggest things that I'd like to see us focus on.
So I'm going to a little bit piggyback on that and then go into some mandate relief. Again, I think our public universities need to provide a more robust educational program for those who want to be teachers. And again, I think it starts with more classes in behavior management, more classes on trauma-informed instruction, and more classes on special ed in general. I think without that, our special ed teachers are running around in circles. I also think that they need to look at some less restrictive reciprocity rules between state to state when it comes for these high need specialized areas. And again, expand that programming. There are not very many occupational therapist programs in the state of Illinois. To that end, I think another area we need to look at in specifically is school nursing. Our current structure is that I have a very, very qualified registered nurse. However, because she doesn't have a school nurse certificate, she can't be considered a certified employee. And getting that certificate and getting those specialized authorizations to be at IEP meetings, it has become so burdensome that it is impossible to find, certified school nurses. And to pay for them to go back to school at the district cost is very pricey, and they're not available very often. So I think that's a big issue that I think we need to focus on, making sure there are nurses in every building and that they can provide those services. And the other has to do with some mandate relief. Every year, the state comes out with another list of curricular mandates and or training module mandates. And I know EdRed has been instrumental in trying to allow our staff to get CDPUs and credits for the mandated trainings that take hours and hours and hours. And I would love us to continue to push and see that through. And I would also like to, have some more forethought in what goes into those mandated trainings and the needs for some of them. Some of them are very outdated. There are some that aren't in there that needs to be in there. And so having that more robust discussion about how we use teacher time and how we can make that more valuable with the mandates that the unfunded mandates that the state is putting forth.
And I think all of these are interconnected when you think about mandates, when you think about funding, when you think about mental health, when you think about all of those, knowing what's out there for families, but also the partnership. We are all trying to do so much to address the complexity of needs of children in our school systems. So knowing what's out there, there's a tremendous effort at the state level on the behavioral network and providing resources. But families in crisis don't know how to get that in the middle of the night. So kind of the connection between state and regional and local and partnerships, a greater understanding of that, but a greater way to address those supports. If we can't find a psychologist or a social worker or counselor, how can we partner with community agencies so we're not competing for those same personnel, that we actually say, we need to make sure that we have those supports within our school systems. So how can we partner to make sure that that's a piece of it? Funding has been a legislative focus since I can remember doing legislative advocacy 20 plus years ago. So it's not funding just for the sake of money, but it is a connection between that and the resources needed to address students whose issues are significant now, but are only going to be compounded 5-10 years from now if those aren't addressed. I really do appreciate this focus on special education and certainly our work in EdRed. I think the wisdom across this group of people right here is really from kind of our own experiences and collaborations in this field, and kind of the depth of our judgments and decision making has really been hopefully influential in the work that we're doing collectively, and that we can continue to instill some hope and positive influence for the future of our students and families. So thank you for this opportunity.
And I'll just put one plug in for the state board. I do think that the three of
Yeah.
us have been around for a long time. And I think sometimes when we get things from the state, it seems like, just another thing to check off our list or something that, doesn't have that great of an impact. But as of late, the state has put out some really great projects. They have the SLD project. As I mentioned before, the Illinois Assistive Technology Project, partnering with Infinitec, the Children's Health Initiative, and Beacon. So these are all really great things that we're seeing come from ISB and with the support of ISB. And I just think that those are the types of things that I would like us to continue to focus on and to really see the positive and the benefit. They had a really great, the SLD project did a really great Institute Day last Friday on October 11th. And it was terrific. And it was all of the ISB projects together putting forth, StarNet is another one, just putting forth different seminars for educators. And those are the things that we need to really get out and be talking about as well. How can we help and support one another and really get that information to the people who need it?
I agree. I think one of the programs that we have utilized a lot in our district, and I know many of my colleagues have as well, are the SEL hubs that the state has put forth. Those are social emotional learning hubs where they provide free training and workshops. We've had them come in and work with our team several times. They have great resources. They have great materials. And I think, we are fortunate that our state recognizes some of these challenges that we had. And I do think that state is trying to provide resources so that we can all support all of our kids and families in our communities. I just think schools can't be the only place where this is happening. So again, encouraging our legislators to work with communities and community centers on how we can provide wraparound services, as it used to be called many years ago, so that schools and communities and families are all partnering together to ensure that our students have the greatest opportunities and the most success that they can reach.
I think the big takeaway here is the importance of partnerships. And I think that's key for all of our districts. Thank you so much for your time. You guys are amazing and true experts in special education. I know that I have learned much from all of you. We hope to continue to work with you guys on any special education or anything dealing with schools in general. But again, thank you for joining us for the AdRed podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.